The War Council chamber aboard the Wrath of the Eternal Sun was filled with the scent of burning incense and the low growl of battle hymns. General Vekvaris stood at the center, his massive form cast in the flickering red glow of the strategy display. The humans were a stain upon the Dominion's honor. A colony of them had appeared on the edge of Zalkir space, defying the natural order. A foolish mistake. "We strike at dawn cycle," Vekvaris growled, his deep voice reverberating through the chamber. 2,000,000 warriors. 500 ships. We descend upon them like the wrath of the void. His golden eyes burned with purpose. No mercy. No prisoners. The humans will learn their place beneath our heel. The officers nodded, their own hunger for conquest evident in the flicker of their mandibles and the slow clench of their talons. The elders had warned against engaging the humans. Cowards. A young officer hesitated, glancing at the shadows of the chamber as though expecting to see something lurking there. The elders. Vekvaris turned his glare toward him, the mere weight of his gaze enough to silence the fool. "Do not speak to me of superstitions. The humans are but flesh and blood. They burn like all the others." The command was given. The fleet launched. And the Zalkir Dominion marched to war. The moment the armada reached the human colony of Vega 7, Vekvaris knew something was wrong. The world was untouched, serene. No planetary defenses. No warning beacons. The human settlement lay exposed, its buildings standing pristine and silent in the warm glow of its star. "Where are their defenses?" Commander Ralshak hissed, his claws clicking against the command panel. Vekvaris bared his fangs. "They have none." He turned to the bombardiers. "Fire upon them. Reduce this insult to dust." The order was obeyed instantly. A wall of plasma descended upon the planet. Vega 7 should have been wiped from existence. But when the smoke cleared, the colony was still standing. Not shielded. Not defended. Untouched. Vekvaris's mandibles tightened. "Report." A silence hung in the command deck, the static hum of instruments the only response. Ralshak's voice cracked through the stillness. "General, it's as if our bombardment never happened." Vekvaris turned slowly. "That is impossible." But the proof was before his eyes. Another volley. Another merciless wave of destruction sent screaming through the atmosphere. He watched as the payload struck, watched as the flames engulfed the colony. And then, the fire was gone. The city remained. No damage. No evidence the attack had ever occurred. Then, the first fleet-wide distress call came through. "General," the voice was cut off by static. "Then, they're gone." Vekvaris's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Another voice, laced with raw terror. "Ships are disappearing, General. Our lead cruisers." And then the signal died. The entire frontline fleet vanished from sensors. Not destroyed. Not shot down. Just gone. Vekvaris stepped forward, the rage bubbling beneath his exoskeleton. "Deploy the war phalanxes. Ground invasion, now." The humans had simply hacked their systems. Tricks. Illusions. Nothing more. But deep inside him, a sliver of unease. 2,000,000 Zalkir warriors landed on Vega 7. The ground beneath them felt wrong, too soft, too smooth. The air had a weight to it, something unseen pressing against their senses. Vekvaris descended last, his massive form stomping onto the soil. His gaze swept across the eerily quiet settlement. His forces advanced in formation, weapons raised. No resistance. Then, the screaming began. A Zalkir officer fell to his knees, clutching his face. His chitin darkened, cracking as he convulsed. He was aging. Not over minutes. Not over hours. Thousands of years in seconds. His body withered, crumbled into dust. More screams. Another soldier stood paralyzed, mouth open in silent horror. Vekvaris turned, and saw the soldier staring at his own corpse, lying at his feet. His own future self. The dead version of him was already there, seconds ahead of his death. Another warrior fell. Then another. Some vanished entirely. Others split apart. Vekvaris saw two versions of the same soldier, flickering between existing and not existing. A voice, calm, human, whispered from the air. "We told you not to come." Vekvaris whirled around, his claws drawn. "Show yourselves, cowards." They did. Not soldiers. Not warriors. Just humans. Standing in the open, unarmed. Watching. They did not move. They did not run. They simply existed. One of them stepped forward. A man, his eyes golden and ancient. He smiled. "You should have listened." Vekvaris charged. His blade slashed the air. The human was gone. No, not gone. He was never there. Vekvaris staggered back. His forces, what was left of them, were frozen in terror. He turned. And saw himself. Hundreds of him. Thousands. Dying. Over. And over. Vekvaris saw his own failures across infinite possibilities. Every path he took led to one fate. Defeat. His voice broke in raw fury. "What are you?" The human looked at him with something like pity. "You never had a choice." The air cracked around Vekvaris. He felt his body unraveling. His mind splintering. His very existence slipping from reality. He tried to call out to his fleet. To his dominion. But he was already forgotten. As though he had never been. The last thing he heard was a whisper. "You should have listened." And then, nothing. The silence stretched across the battlefield, thick and suffocating. Vekvaris forced himself to move, his talons digging into the unnatural soil beneath him. The remnants of his army stood frozen, their eyes wide with the horror of what they had just witnessed. The humans did not advance. They did not press their advantage. They simply stood there, unarmed, unprotected, their expressions unreadable. Vekvaris snarled, forcing his limbs to obey his command. He was not broken. He was Zalkir. Fear was an affliction of the weak, and he had conquered too many worlds, crushed too many empires beneath his heel, to falter before them. "You think this display is enough to shatter us?" His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. His remaining warriors snapped to attention, their training overriding their terror. "You are not gods. You are not untouchable. Whatever trickery this is, I will." The human with golden eyes tilted his head, as if listening to something beyond the confines of time itself. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice almost gentle. "This isn't about war. It never was." Vekvaris lunged, his blade aimed for the human's throat. He had no patience for riddles, no tolerance for weakness. The edge of his weapon cut through empty air. The human was not there. No. The human had never been there. Vekvaris' own momentum sent him staggering forward. The ground shifted beneath him, a subtle tremor that vibrated through his bones. He turned to his soldiers, about to issue another command. But something was wrong. Half of them were gone. Not dead. Not defeated. Just missing. The battlefield looked wrong. His mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. Had the soldiers ever been there at all? He knew they had. He had marched beside them, commanded them. Then why couldn't he remember their faces? Panic curled like smoke in the edges of his thoughts, but he crushed it down. He had never doubted himself before, and he would not start now. He turned back to the human, his voice a growl. "What are you doing?" The human's golden eyes pierced through him. "Nothing," he said simply. "This is what always happens." A shiver ran through Vekvaris' exoskeleton. Not from fear. From something worse. The battle was over. But there had been no battle. He took a step back, gripping his weapon tighter. His soldiers, the few that remained, looked to him for direction, for reassurance. They were warriors, trained to conquer, to dominate. They had fought in wars across the stars, reduced planets to ruin. But there was no enemy to fight. There was nothing to kill. Only the silence. Rorschach, his most trusted second-in-command, stepped forward. His voice was tight, restrained. "General, the fleet is not responding." Vekvaris's jaw clenched. He activated his communicator. Static. He turned to his officers, his claws flexing. "Re-establish contact." They scrambled, working through encrypted channels, trying to force a response from any of the warships in orbit. The response came a moment later, not from his fleet, but from the humans. "You cannot call to something that no longer exists." The golden-eyed human said it so casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. Vekvaris ignored the growing unease clawing at the back of his mind. "Explain," he ordered. His voice was still sharp, still filled with command. He would not be toyed with. "You think you are here, leading an invasion," the human said. "But you do not understand time. You perceive it as linear, a straight line you march forward on. That is your flaw." The other humans, the ones standing behind him, the ones watching, said nothing. But Vekvaris felt them. Their presence weighed on him in a way he could not explain, as if their very existence was pressing against the structure of reality itself. The golden-eyed human took a step forward, slow, deliberate. "You and your army have already lost. You just haven't realized it yet." Vekvaris roared, slamming his blade into the ground. The tremor shook the battlefield, cracks forming beneath his feet. "Enough of this madness. Fight me. Face me in combat." The human's gaze never wavered. "That's not how this ends." A soldier beside Vekvaris choked out a sound. He turned, irritation flashing through him. The warrior was staring at his own hands. And they were fading. Not being erased. Not being torn apart. Just ceasing to exist. The warrior's breathing became ragged, panicked. "General," he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't." And then he was gone. Vekvaris saw it happen. 1 second he was there. The next, he had never been. There was no blood. No scream. Just absence. The other soldiers saw it, too. Then, the next one vanished. Then another. One by one, his warriors were ceasing to be. Vekvaris's mind raced. This was not possible. This was not how war worked. "You do not understand," the human said again. His voice had not changed, but there was something behind it now. Something vast. Vekvaris turned his weapon on him once more. "Fix this." The human exhaled, as if he pitied him. "This cannot be fixed." Another officer vanished. Then another. Vekvaris's heart slammed against his ribs. "Tell me what this is," he demanded. "What are you doing to us?" The golden-eyed human shook his head. "This is not an attack." Vekvaris could not breathe. "Your war, your fleet, your entire campaign against us, has already happened. It happened 1,000 times before this moment. And in every version of it, you lost." Vekvaris stepped back, his claws curling into fists. "No," he growled. The human's golden eyes flickered. "Yes." More soldiers vanished. His army, his empire's finest warriors, were being unmade. Rorschach was the last one left. He turned to Vekvaris, his voice shaking. "General, I." And then he was gone. Vekvaris stood alone. The battlefield was empty. His entire invasion force had never existed. His war had never happened. His fleet was gone. His legacy was gone. His name was fading from his own memory. The golden-eyed human stepped forward once more. "You see now, don't you?" Vekvaris felt himself coming apart. His vision blurred, his limbs heavy. The world around him stretched, pulled, as if time itself was unraveling. "What are you?" he whispered. The human smiled. "We are the end of wars." Vekvaris collapsed to his knees. His body was eroding. He tried to remember his own name. It was already gone. The last thing he heard before he ceased to be was the human's whisper. "You should have listened." The silence was absolute. Vekvaris was alone. His claws scraped against the soil, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The battlefield where his army had once stood was empty, the air thick with something he could not name. There was no trace of the 2 million soldiers that had landed at his side. No remains. No blood. It was as if they had never existed at all. He reached for his communicator, gripping it so tightly his talons cracked the metal casing. "This is General Vekvaris." His voice was steel, his authority absolute. "Respond." Static. His fleet should have been overhead, ready to obliterate the planet if the invasion force faltered. Yet, no reply came. He tried another frequency. Then another. Nothing. The silence pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. "You will not receive a response." The voice was calm. Too calm. Vekvaris turned, his blade raised, his muscles coiled for attack. The golden-eyed human stood before him, hands clasped behind his back. The other humans, the ones who had simply watched, remained unmoving behind him. Their expressions were unreadable, their presence unnatural. "What have you done?" Vekvaris snarled. "Where are my warriors?" "They were never here." His grip on his weapon tightened. "Lies." The human tilted his head slightly, studying him. "No. Truth. The kind you refuse to accept." Vekvaris took a step forward. "I remember them. I saw them. They landed beside me." "Yes," the human agreed. "And then they didn't." The words sent a shudder through him. He had fought in 1,000 wars, crushed civilizations beneath his heel, led his people to dominance. But this was something else. There was no battle. No war. No enemy to fight. Only absence. Vekvaris lunged, swinging his blade in a savage arc. He felt it cut through air. The human did not move, did not flinch. Because the human had never been standing there in the first place. He staggered forward, his balance faltering. The golden-eyed figure remained where he had been, his expression untouched by emotion. "You still do not understand," the human said. "You perceive time as a straight line. A sequence of events that follow one another. A past, a present, a future." Vekvaris straightened, his rage cold and sharp. "And what do you claim it is?" The human's golden eyes burned. "It is an ocean." A laugh, bitter and low, rumbled from his chest. "I do not have time for riddles." "No," the human said softly. "You don't." Vekvaris opened his mouth to respond, but then the world lurched. He was falling. Not through space. Not through air. But through something else. He was somewhere else. The battlefield was gone. Instead, he stood aboard the bridge of his flagship. His officers were at their stations. The strategy display flickered with data. His fleet hung above Vega 7, weapons primed. He was back before the invasion had begun. Vekvaris' mind sharpened, his instincts roaring to attention. He turned to Ralshak, his most trusted officer. "Status." Ralshak's mandibles twitched. "We await your order, General." His order. To attack. The Elder's warning rang in his mind, "Do not engage the humans." Vekvaris' claws tapped against the metal railing. His memory was intact. He remembered everything. The failed invasion. The missing soldiers. The vanishing of his entire existence. He turned, scanning the bridge. No one else remembered. For them, the invasion had not yet begun. He could still stop this. A cold realization settled into his bones. This is a test. He had been brought back. Given a second chance. He could order the retreat. He could spare his people. His claws clenched. Or he could defy fate itself. A slow, sharp grin spread across his face. Fire upon the planet. The officers moved instantly, weapons priming. He refused to let this trickery, overcome the Dominion. The Zalkir did not retreat. The first barrage was launched. Fire rained down upon the surface of Vega 7. And nothing changed. Vekvaris watched, his breath slow and even. Then, the first ship vanished. Then the second. The fleet was blinking out of existence. Just as before. He turned his head sharply, and there, at the edge of the bridge, stood the golden-eyed human. Vekvaris growled. I will not be your puppet. The human stepped forward, his movements impossibly smooth. You were never in control. The bridge flickered. The officers were gone. The warships were gone. Vekvaris stood alone. No. Not alone. The human still watched. The battlefield reformed around him, returning him to Vega 7's surface. The illusion of choice was shattered. You think you can break me, Vekvaris snarled. But I am Zalkir. I am war itself. No, the human said. You are lost. And then Vekvaris saw it. The truth. Vega 7 was not real. It was not a planet. It was a point in time. A trap set for those who did not listen. He saw them. The thousands of versions of himself across endless realities, all making the same mistake, all walking the same path, all vanishing. He saw the elders, whispering their warnings, only for his arrogance to doom him. He saw his name erased from history, over and over again. Vekvaris roared, defiant. This will not be my end. The golden-eyed human regarded him with something almost like sorrow. This was never your end. Vekvaris felt himself unraveling. His body became light. Shadow. Thought. Nothing. The last thing he heard was a whisper, gentle and final. You should have listened. And then nothing. The silence swallowed everything. Vekvaris felt weightless, adrift in something vast and unknowable. His body, his mind, his very sense of existence flickered at the edges. He could no longer feel the ground beneath him, no longer hear the hum of his armor's power core, no longer command his own breathing. He was suspended, caught between what was and what had never been. Then, the voices came. Oft at first. Whispers curling through the emptiness. Not words, echoes. Should not have come. Always ends the same. You never had a choice. His vision snapped into focus. He was somewhere else. The battlefield was gone. The world of Vega 7 had unraveled like a lie exposed to the truth. In its place stretched an endless expanse of nothingness, a void without stars, without time. And yet, he was not alone. They were here. All of them. He turned, his chest tightening. He saw himself. Hundreds. Thousands. An uncountable number of Vekvaris warlords, all standing in the abyss. Each one different. Each one the same. Some bore scars from battles he had never fought. Others wore armor forged from metals unknown to him. But their faces, their expressions, identical. Confusion. Fury. Realization. You see it now, the voice murmured, and he turned to find the golden-eyed human standing at the center of it all. Vekvaris' claws curled into fists. What is this? The human studied him, those unnatural golden eyes gleaming. This is where you always arrive, General. Vekvaris bared his fangs. Explain. The human gestured around them. Every time a Vekvaris exists in a reality where the Zalkir ignore the Elder's warning and engage humanity, this happens. Every time, you lead your armies to Vega 7. Every time, you order your ships to fire. Every time, you refuse to retreat. His voice remained calm, even, certain. "And every time, you end up here." Vekvaris inhaled sharply, his mandibles clicking as his rage boiled over. "What is this place?" The human tilted his head slightly, as if considering the best way to answer. "A memory. A conclusion. A lesson." He let the words settle before continuing. "You exist in a moment of time that should not be. A moment that has been corrected." Vekvaris took a step forward, his presence towering, formidable. "You call this correction?" His voice was venom, his rage honed to a blade. "I call it cowardice. You have not won a war, human. You have rewritten it to suit your weakness." The human sighed, almost disappointed. "No, General. We have evolved beyond war." Vekvaris snarled. "Then fight me." The human blinked. "Why?" Vekvaris swung, his blade cutting through the space between them only to find nothing. The golden-eyed figure stood unmoved, unshaken. "You still think in terms of battle. Of victory. Of dominance. But this is not a war, Vekvaris. This is an inevitability." A shudder crawled through his exoskeleton. He turned, his burning gaze sweeping over the thousands of other versions of himself, all standing in grim silence. "How many of us?" His voice was low, dangerous. The human met his gaze. "Every version of you that made the same mistake." Vekvaris clenched his fists. "And the ones who didn't?" The human's expression softened. "They still exist." Something in his mind cracked at those words. He had believed himself infallible. A warlord without equal. But there were others, versions of himself who had chosen differently. Who had listened. And they still existed. While he was here. Vekvaris's breath hitched. "You erased me." The human nodded once. "Yes." Rage surged up like a wildfire, but beneath it, beneath the instinct to conquer, to command, to refuse defeat, was something else. Something cold. Something heavier than fear. The truth. "Why?" The human's golden eyes pierced through him. "Because you lost before you even began." The words settled like stone in his chest. This was never a battle. Never a war. It was a test of understanding. The elders of your kind knew, long ago, that humanity is beyond conflict. That we do not engage in wars because we do not need to. The golden-eyed figure took a slow step forward, his presence filling the emptiness. "The moment you refused to listen, you sealed your fate. The moment you ordered the invasion, you stepped onto a path with only one ending. And now." The human gestured toward the thousands of other Vekvaris standing in silence. "You are here. With all the others who refused to listen." The abyss shifted. The air rippled, like the fabric of reality itself was struggling to contain its own correction. Vekvaris's hands trembled. "What happens now?" The human exhaled softly. "You disappear." A slow dread coiled in his stomach. "And my people?" The human held his gaze. "They forget you ever existed." The realization struck like a blade to the chest. His victories. His empire. His legacy. Gone. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Just erased. "You cannot do this," he snarled, his voice trembling between rage and desperation. "We already have," the human replied. Vekvaris's breath came hard and fast. His mind fought against the inevitable. He was not meant to be forgotten. He was a warlord, a conqueror. He had shaped history with blood and fire. He could not simply cease. He refused. But the unraveling had already begun. His vision blurred. His limbs felt weightless. The world around him faded, as though he had never belonged to it. He opened his mouth, one final roar of defiance tearing from his throat. But there was no sound. Because there was no him. And then, nothing. The elders of the Zalkir Dominion gathered in the Grand Council chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, the weight of unseen knowledge pressing upon them. One of them, the eldest among them, exhaled slowly. It has happened again. The others nodded in solemn agreement. A young warlord stood at attention, his armor gleaming, his eyes burning with the hunger for conquest. Elder, our fleets are primed. The scouts report a human presence on the border. Shall we move to engage? The elder's eyes, ancient, weary, knowing, lifted toward the stars. No. The young warlord frowned. Why? Surely they. Because, the elder murmured, you do not understand what they are. The young warrior stiffened. Then tell me. The elder met his gaze. No. The young warlord clenched his fists, frustration flashing across his face. But he did not argue. Because deep in his bones, asterisk asterisk in the memory of something his mind could not recall, asterisk asterisk a whisper echoed. You should have listened. The council chamber was quiet. The young warlord shifted where he stood, his frustration barely masked behind the rigid discipline of a soldier. He had expected orders. He had expected a declaration of war, the command to strike down the humans and claim what should have always belonged to the Zalkir dominion. Instead, the elders spoke only of caution. You tell us not to engage, he said, voice sharp, laced with defiance. But you offer no reason. The elder met his gaze, unblinking. There is no reason you would accept. A growl rumbled deep in the young warlord's chest. Do we not rule by conquest? Have we not crushed every empire in our path? What makes the humans so different? The elder exhaled, a slow, weary breath, as if he had lived this conversation many times before. Because we are still here. The warlord frowned. What? If we had engaged them, we would not be, the elder said simply. A murmur passed through the room. It was an absurd thing to say, an insult to the Dominion's strength. The Zalkir had never faced an enemy they could not destroy. Their fleets stretched across the stars, their warriors born for war, their empire eternal. Yet, something in the elder's voice unsettled the warlord. He had expected arrogance, fear, political maneuvering, not resignation. You have fought many wars, the elder continued. You have faced enemies who screamed as they fell, who fought until their last breath, who burned their own worlds before surrendering. You know what it means to fight something that still believes it can win. He leaned forward, his gaze heavy. What do you think happens when you fight something that does not need to win? The warlord opened his mouth, but no words came. The elder did not blink. There is no victory to be had against the humans. Because to them, victory and defeat are meaningless. They do not play the same game. They do not see war as we do. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The warlord forced himself to scoff. Then they are cowards. No, the elder said. They are inevitable. The warlord bristled. We are the inevitable ones. The elder shook his head. No. We are a ripple in the river. They are the current. The warlord clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. Then why do they not rule? If they are so powerful, why do they not conquer the stars as we have? Why do they not burn their enemies to ash? The elder's mandibles clicked softly, a sound almost like regret. Because they do not need to. The warlord stepped forward, his voice lowering into something dangerous. Then tell me, elder. What do they do? The elder's eyes, dark and deep with something that should not be known, locked onto his. They erase. A chill crawled down the warlord's spine. They do not conquer, the elder continued. They do not fight. They do not bleed for their victories, because for them, victory is already decided. The warlord shook his head. That is impossible. The elder tilted his head slightly. Is it? Something in the air shifted, and the warlord's vision blurred. For a heartbeat, asterisk asterisk, just a single heartbeat, asterisk asterisk, he saw something else. A vast, endless void. An army standing in silence, unmoving. Thousands of warriors. Thousands of himself. And then, nothing. The vision was gone, but the unease remained, crawling beneath his skin. He swallowed hard. He stopped himself. He didn't know what that was. The elder studied him carefully. You felt it, didn't you? The warlord forced his voice to remain steady. A trick. The elder shook his head. No. A warning. A heavy silence settled in the chamber. The warlord did not want to admit it, but something was wrong. He had felt it the moment he spoke of war against the humans. A wrongness in the air, as if something unseen had shifted, as if he had already set a series of events in motion that could not be undone. He tried to shake it off. Then why do the humans not come for us? If they are so far beyond us, why do they let us exist? The elder gave him a long, unreadable look. Because we are not a threat to them. The words stung. The warlord's pride roared against them. We are the Dominion, he said, his voice cold. We are a threat to all who stand before us. The elder nodded slowly. Yes. And that is why, in every future where we make war against the humans, the same thing always happens. The warlord did not want to ask. He asked anyway. What happens? The elder's voice was barely above a whisper. We disappear. The warlord's heart pounded against his ribs. You mean we are defeated? No, the elder's gaze was steady. We cease to exist. Something in the warlord's chest tightened. This was not fear. It was worse. Fear was something tangible, something he could fight, something he could conquer. This was wrongness. A war without battle. A loss without defeat. An enemy that did not need to fight at all. I do not believe you, he said, though the words rang hollow in his own ears. The elder exhaled slowly. Neither did he. The warlord stiffened. Who? The elder leaned back in his chair, his voice distant. You do not remember him. None of us do. But he was once a great general of the Dominion. A warlord who led the greatest invasion force we had ever assembled. The elder's voice dropped lower. He led them to Vega 7. The warlord's mandibles tightened. There is no such battle in our records. The elder nodded once. Exactly. The warlord stared at him. He was like you, the elder murmured. He was strong. Proud. Certain of his place in the universe. He believed, as you do, that we were the ones who shaped the stars. The elder's fingers curled against the table. And then he was gone. A cold sensation settled into the warlord's gut. He did not know this general. Had never heard of him. And yet, something in his bones whispered. You do not know his name, the elder said. Because there is nothing left to remember. The warlord's breath came slow, measured. Then how do you know he ever existed? The elder gave him a small, tired smile. Because the humans let me remember. The warlord could not breathe. For the first time in his life, he did not know what to say. A long silence passed between them. The elder studied him for a moment before speaking again. You are still young. You have the chance to choose differently. He folded his hands. What will you do? The warlord's mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time, he did not want to fight. For the first time, he wanted to listen. He straightened his stance, voice calm, measured. We will not engage. The elder nodded slowly, approval flickering in his ancient eyes. Then, for now, we still exist.